Hello to everybody in Fine Arts 104. Good to be speaking to all of you once again, and I hope the past week has been treating all of you well. Popping in to give you this week's topic and discussion. And why don't I start off with a little bit of class related business as well, just to clarify in case there were any lingering questions, or to re-clarify, I guess I should say. The screening response writing assignments are done for the rest of the semester. You only had a couple of them left, regardless, but we just rolled those into the discussion boards from now until the end of the semester. So you'll have to do two discussion board posts per week, as well as responding to your classmates' posts each week. One of those posts will be about the previous week's screening, in effect, just replacing the screening response as a standalone assignment. And then the other discussion board post responds to that particular week's topic of discussion. So you've got that for basically this week and next. This would be week 14 if this semester had carried on as per usual. It is week 14 regardless, just feels different. Since it's what, the fifth week or something like that, sixth week since the world got upended. Time is, if anybody's watched the TV show The Good Place, somebody described this very well. The week is losing its traditional rhythm, and the passage of 7 days has just become Jeremy Bearimy. If you get that joke, I hope you liked it. If not, watch The Good Place. It's on Hulu, and I think it's still on Netflix. Regardless, uh, yeah, you've got those, the work on the discussion board. You've also got your final essay that you should be working on already. The proposal for that is due about a week from now, if I'm recalling correctly. And your task there is just to pick one of the movies that we've watched in class. It could be one of the shared screenings we had in the first 10 weeks of the semester, 9 weeks of the semester, however many weeks it was, or it can be one of the screenings you've done on your own time since the world got turned upside down. You have to do a critical analysis of it, relying on both factual research that you'll do into the film, maybe looking if you can find articles perhaps about its production process, these sorts of things. Those could be useful. But the main thing is applying critical analysis to it using one of these modes of spectatorship, modes of analysis that we have been covering in these last few weeks of class here. This week's topic is ideology. Previously, we had talked what about social context? We talked about genre. That's what we're looking for. So you can look at something like, oh, I don't know, Fantasia, and analyze it in the context of genre, in the context of the animation genre, where it certainly does fit in based on the mode of production. It's an cell shaded animated film, but it is not very much like other animated films. Like my son, my 3-year-old, had a very good time watching Moana this morning. I don't know how he would respond to Fantasia. I know some of you, perhaps, did not respond all that lovingly towards Fantasia, and I think a lot of that is because it doesn't meet our expectations, maybe perhaps primarily for narrative, but also for genre, just for the expectation of an animated film generally. So that's sort of the idea here, looking at the movie and analyzing it with the lens of one of these modes of interpretation, modes of analysis that we've talked about over the course of the latter half of this semester here. If you've got any questions about this, picking a topic, settling on how to analyze it, crafting a thesis, all of that sort of thing, feel free to email me, of course, or pop into the Zoom meetings. I did want to mention, I don't know if this has been unclear to anybody, but you can pop into any of the Zoom meetings that I have throughout the week, not just the one that's at 5:30 on Thursdays. You're always welcome to pop into that one, of course. I'll be there. But just to clarify, you don't have to feel locked into just that time slot. If you're free and want to pop into Zoom at a different time, go for it. All right. All that being said, we should talk about the main issue at hand for this week, and that is ideology. Ideology is a big enough topic that it probably, I mean, you literally you could do a whole semester, a whole academic life, uh, based around interpreting cinema through the perspective of ideology, and probably through a specific ideology here. But just to kind of state the general topic, Ideologies are systems of thought or belief that provide structure and rules for how we think, how we live, how we understand the world around us, and how we relate to one another. So, to give a fairly familiar example, one might hope, democracy is an ideology. It's a political ideology, it's a governmental ideology. It's based upon a belief that the people should rule, that the best way for a country to govern itself and to organize its power is through people voting and making their voices heard through some sort of democratic means. That might feel like something that has nothing to do with cinema. You would be surprised. Cinema has a lot to say about democracy, maybe even specifically about American democracy as well. If you want to check out classic films, something like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, It's a Wonderful Life, oh my God, it was just The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. All of these are classic movies, Golden Age Hollywood, that are deeply, deeply wound up with the issues of American democracy. How do a people govern themselves? Young Mr. Lincoln, another example. You get the idea. So ideologies are it's probably a term you're familiar with, and the concepts themselves you will definitely be familiar with. And ideologies are all around of us. A lot of them are quite political. Certainly, the ones that come to my mind a lot are political. I tend to be a political person, fair to say, and so that maybe influences it. But ideology is not purely political. It can touch on every aspect of life. And a lot of times I think we make it ideologies almost sound too remote, perhaps sometimes when we talk about them. One of the potential screenings for you this week is a recent film called Ladybird. Beautiful movie, and if you ever want to get a sense of what it was like when I was in high school, as Catholic high school in the early 2000s, Greta Gerwig, the writer and director of Ladybird, man, she nailed it. Boy, did she get that whole social dynamic correct. And a lot of the reason I responded to the movie is not just because she understood my background, seemingly it was her own as well, but because the main character spends the entire film mixing and matching personal ideologies. And sometimes that is overtly political. There's a funny punchline in Ladybird where she looks at a friend and scoffs and says, "Don't be a Republican." I'm not necessarily endorsing it. It's just a good punchline. But oftentimes her ideologies are much more personal. She sees herself as an artist, opposed to a worker, like she thinks her mom is. Her mom is a nurse. She sees herself as independent rather than family oriented, individualistic, to the point that she alienates friends and steps on other people and hurts them. She also sees herself as a lover, as a fighter. All of these are ideologies. All of these are personalities to some degree, but those personalities are based around how we interpret the larger social structure that surrounds us, how we internalize it, and how we live our lives based upon these codes, so to speak. The movie that we would have watched in class tonight, if we had normal class this week, I think is a really good example of this. It's a movie called Far From Heaven, which is a little tough to track down to my frustration. I was able to find a used copy at Reckless Records. Now I'm mad that that copy is locked away at Harold Washington College. But the movie is set in the 1950s in suburban United States. It's filmed like a 1950s melodrama, really rich, oversaturated technicolor production design, very stylized, if you're looking for that, perhaps, as a way of interpreting the film. But the content of the film is about a suburban housewife, seemingly a perfect family, who sees it all crumble because her husband is a closeted gay man, and she has to confront the fact that her life, to some degree, has been a lie. She's been living with a man who is lying to himself about himself. But also, she has to confront the fact that it's not just the personal lack of clarity. All of a sudden her social status is greatly upended, not just by the fact that her husband and her are getting a divorce, that there's this, well, I guess actually that is one of the main things, There's the rumors that her husband is gay, which causes social ostracization in a way that I think a gay couple living in suburban Connecticut would not face today, 65 years later. There's also the fact that she's getting divorced. And as odd as that might sound to us today, divorce was an ideological issue. It was a very clear cut black or white, you're pro or anti. And as late as the 1960s, 1970s, probably 1970s, it would have been unthinkable for respectable people to get divorced. There was a guy running for president in the 1960s named Nelson Rockefeller, probably lost the nomination for president because he got divorced a year and a half before the presidential contest. That alone alienated him from countless millions of people across the United States because divorce was something we don't do because there was a rule around that. The ideology of respectable middle class American propriety was you don't divorce. That's just not a thing. We don't do it. That's an ideology. The movie forces the characters to confront that. The way the main character's social status crumbles because of the marital problems she faces, but she also faces yet another ideological hurdle in the movie. Her family employs an African American man as a gardener. If you watch it, it's played by Dennis Haysbert. He might know as the Allstate guy. Um, but uh, she eventually develops something like romantic feelings for this man, but both of them know that there's a huge gulf that separates them socially. She's white and middle class and a woman. He is black and working class and a man. And those two ideological identities, and that's an important thing to note here. Identity itself is ideological. I identify as a straight white male cisgendered man. There's a whole huge pile of ideologies that my sense of identity is built upon: masculinity, heterosexuality, whiteness, traditional gender roles. There are many people who were probably born in similar circumstances as I am, but live very different lifestyles because they have different personal identities based on different social, cultural, political ideologies. And those differences of identity are often, just as often, a difference of ideology as well. You can't see your way towards somebody else's perspective, not just because you disagree with them, but because your ideology is sort of the architecture of your mind. It provides the framework for where you can go and cannot, which doors are open, which windows are closed, but you can still see through what's completely invisible to us, what's buried underneath the floor, so to speak. So, ideology is rich in films because it allows us to interpret the characters and their circumstances and their behaviors based on these systems of belief. But ideology is also a really rich vein for us to look at from a very particular lens. Something like Ladybird, for example, could lend itself to interesting ideological analysis because it's written and directed by a woman. And so you might launch a feminist ideological analysis of Ladybird, asking how does it represent the ideology that all people, regardless of their gender, should be treated equally, which is the definition of feminism. And so you would look at how Lady Bird does that, and it's not like the characters themselves stop and declaim about their particular personal ideologies. Instead, just like any story, these movies act as myths. They tell relatively simple stories: a girl growing into adulthood, a family going through a crisis, but present them as a way of but tell these stories while also using that as a way of presenting ideologies for us to accept and understand and internalize. Lady Bird doesn't scream at you about the particular ideologies of its characters. It's much too good a movie for that. Instead, it asks you to think of circumstances you might have faced that were similar to this. Far From Heaven might ask you to think of how your circumstances are different from this. The German film that's potentially out there for you to watch, Head On, asks us to look at a social circumstance. That would be a good one for social context, by the way, as a form of analysis that is radically different than anything in my personal life. But I still respond to it quite a lot. But ideological analysis, it looks for a movie and tries to see how it presents certain perspectives on the world. How does Lady Bird present a maybe feminist perspective on, being a young woman in the United States in the 2000s? Far From Heaven, directed by a gay man, how does it perhaps represent it sounds kind of odd to say, a ideological perspective on hiding yourself, which has often been a major part of hiding parts of yourself, at least even from yourself, a major part of the gay experience and sort of the ideological unpacking of that. A movie like Far on the Waterfront, which is on Crackle, you could watch that as a free screening this week. That is a movie all about the director, Elia Kazan, named names to government investigators into Communist Party activities back in the 1940s and 1950s, and he presented this movie as an ideological defense of telling the truth and ratting on people, even when it causes you to lose your friends and acquaintances. He won an Oscar for this movie, but he also lost a lot of people's I don't know, respect? I don't know. It's an interesting movie to interpret, especially along ideological lines. How do you feel about a movie that says turning on your friends and family and talking to the cops about what they have done is a good and noble thing to do? Does that feel like a good and noble thing to do to you? I mean, I would hope so in many circumstances. But raising questions like that provides dramatic impetus for the movie, but it also provides ideological uh, it provides material for ideological analysis, and that's exactly what we're doing every time we watch a movie. We are judging a movie based upon the ideas it presents to us, how well it represents those ideas to us, and how much we agree with them. There are certain movies that I will never screen in class, despite their importance, because I find their ideologies to be abhorrent. Birth of a Nation, not not ever shown a movie about how great the Ku Klux Klan is. And when I do show movies that advance an ideology that I find it abhorrent, I have to do it in a way that makes it clear we're watching this as like a sociological thing rather than a piece of entertainment or a thing I agree with. A movie like the Nazi propaganda Triumph of the Will is as evil as can be imagined. Uh, its ideological content is a, literally a crime against humanity. And yet, it is incredibly important to the history of filmmaking for the aesthetic presentation, which has a huge influence, uh, but also because it allows us to see how even something as evil as Nazism can be presented through the cinema as just another idea, just a good way of thinking. So that's it's a big topic. Like I said, you could spend a whole lifetime thinking about this, but it should provide you with some pretty good material to think about this week. All right, that's all for now.